Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Why Buddhism? Why Theravada? Theravada, Mahayana, Hinayana. 3 essays by M.O.C. Walshe. Narrated by Avia Rose Livni. Why Buddhism? From the Buddhist Path, July 1967. There's a periodical called which provides guidance to the shopper as to the best bargains among the various branded wares in the market. From cars to contraceptives, from sausages to sewing machines. Nowadays, people will shop around for anything, even a religion or a philosophy of life. There is plenty of choice. Christianity in 57 varieties, communism, humanism, spiritualism, alcoholism, drugism, beetleism, not to mention those steady favorites, do not knowism and couldn't care lessism. Since every ism usually has several schisms, the selection is practically unlimited. Catholicism, with a capital C, has given place to Catholicism with a small c. The din is appalling, as the siren strains of the admin compete with the manic screams of the madmen, and sometimes the two are hard to tell apart. Among the wares on offer is something called Buddhism. This too comes in several brands, including instant Zen. All these things must be seen for what they are, manifestations of dukkha. We find life unbearable, and so we drug ourselves with spirits, sex, LSD, speed, or even horror films. We go off into reveries and fantasies of all kinds. We are willing to face anything and everything in life but ourselves. The short answer to the question, why Buddhism, is simply this: because it was Gautama Buddha who taught men how to come to terms with the nasty mess inside their own minds. That is really the only problem we have. Youth, we are told today, is in revolt. The younger generation, faced with the atom bomb and all the horrors of respectable society bequeathed by its elders, is not going to pray. It has decided to drop out. This is just one of those half-truths and quarter-truths we all put up, and is no more valid than any one of the other excuses put up by people of all ages. Of course, the world is in a mess, but it always has been, because man is unenlightened. Of course, it is not true to say, with some, that our present-day troubles are due to decline of religion, just like that. But the crisis in the churches adds to the general moral confusion, and Rome burns while the Pope ponders the pill. If Christianity suffers from a fatal credibility gap, the thoughts of Mao and Kosygin seem scarcely more relevant, while the loudly proclaimed optimism of the humanists begins to sound suspiciously like what it really is: a desperate whistling in the dark. Besides, our so-called scientific humanists are extraordinarily selective in their facts. For there is a whole dimension to life beyond the reach of computers of any conceivable kind. Mind is more wonderful than matter, and far less understood. As the facts of extrasensory perception, spiritual healing, and the rest become more and more generally known, the total inadequacy of conventional science to explain the world becomes almost as glaringly obvious as is that of conventional religion. And this is where Buddhism comes in. Biologists, as well as bishops, need to do their homework better here. We have one reason, and a very good and proper reason, for preferring Buddhists to Western schools of thought. It provides more adequate and credible explanations of the world we live in and of man's existential dilemma. Yet this, though true and admirable, is by no means enough. For Buddhism, taken purely intellectually, does not do the patient much real good. Buddhism is not something to believe, but something to do. It is a do-it-yourself religion, although, as has been pointed out by one bhikkhu, this means do it yourself and not do it yourself. The Dhamma is described in the following terms. Svakkato Bhagavata Dhammo Sanditiko Akaliko Ehipassiko Opanaiko Pachatang Veditabu Vinyuhiti. This means, well proclaimed is the Dhamma of the Blessed One, to be seen for oneself, timeless, inviting inspection, leading onwards to Nibbana, to be realized by the wise, each one for himself. Every word of this characterization merits the most careful consideration. Thus, sanditiko, to be seen for oneself, implies the right view, sammaditthi, which is the first step of the path. A view unclouded by greed, hate, and delusion. Akaliko, timeless, denotes that the Dhamma is not in time, is not affected by time, and also that its effect is immediate. And its message is as much for this age as for any other. The idea of seeing is again expressed in the term ehipassiko, derived from the imperative, come and see. The doctrine is open to inspection and examination. We are not being offered a pig in a poke. Opanaiko means leading onwards to the goal. Finally, this Dhamma is something to be realized or experienced, veditabu, by the wise, vinyuhi, each for himself, pachatang. By treading the path, we can come to know, of our own experience, the truth of the Buddha's teaching. None can say fairer than that. There are other and good spiritual paths which can bring those who tread them to much happiness. Whether they lead him right out of samsara to the beyond of suffering is a different matter which we shall not consider here. Within the Buddhist field, too, there are different schools of thought. The claim of Theravada Buddhism, as taught in the Pāli Canon, rests on the directness of its approach and its penetration to the very heart of reality. The West is still preoccupied with the old conflict of science and religion, and whether these can be reconciled, or whether indeed science leaves any room for religion at all. In the terms of this conflict, Buddhism cannot be identified with either science or religion as conventionally conceived, though if we define religion as a way of salvation, then obviously Buddhism is a religion. But it is better viewed as the true scientific basis underlying all religions. If that is so, then while other paths may lead to the same goal, they are detours. Buddhism, and Theravada Buddhism in particular, is the direct way. Why Theravada? From the Buddhist Path, September 1967. The Theravada, or teaching of the elders, is the form of Buddhism based on the Pāli Canon, is taught in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, and its claim is that it represents the original teaching of the Buddha in its purity. There may be, indeed there are, arguments about this, but it is difficult to resist the conclusion that in the Pāli Canon we have, to all appearances, the only authentic record of what Gautama the Buddha actually said. And if the Pāli language, in which his words are preserved, is not quite identical with his own language of discourse, as most, but not quite all, Western scholars seem to agree. There is certainly no reason at all to suppose that he spoke Sanskrit, still less any other of the languages of the various Mahayana canons. More important is the fact that we have here a system of practice which leads directly to the goal, the world's finest mental therapy. For that is what Buddhism is. The Buddha diagnosed our ills and prescribed the cure. Here in the West, we sometimes describe the Theravada as basic Buddhism. This is fair enough, though the term can be interpreted in more than one way. It can be taken to mean that here we have all the fundamentals, all that is really necessary, so that whatever is additionally taught in other schools is ultimately superfluous. Or it can be taken to mean that this must be learned and mastered first before one goes on to the higher flights of Mahayana, etc. The former supposition represents the Theravada standpoint, properly speaking. Its validity will not be argued here. What about the latter view? The implications of this view are actually rather interesting and may prove disconcerting to some. Let us examine the resultant situation, for which purpose a little historical knowledge is necessary. Mahayanists in general, apart from some scholars in quite modern times, have normally had virtually no direct knowledge of the Theravada tradition. What they refer to as Hinayana is in fact a scholastic tradition by no means totally identical with Theravada, and Mahayana polemics have therefore little or no relevance to this, being simply concerned with flogging the long-since dead horse of their Sarvastivada. The strength of the Mahayana, if one can generalize about such a vast range of proliferating traditions, lies in its recognition of the provisional nature of certain truths enunciated in the basic scriptures. Its corresponding weakness, even in the East, lies in a frequent failure to appreciate that these provisional truths must first be thoroughly mastered before they are discarded. While it is useless to carry a raft after you have crossed the stream, it is premature to throw it away before you get to the water. It was perhaps unfortunate for some Oriental countries that they received Buddhism in a purely Mahayana form, which must inevitably make it extremely difficult to get started. For Western Buddhists to ignore the opportunity to lay a firm foundation by training in the Theravada way is folly. But we can go further. Granted that one is interested in Mahayana, how far then should one first proceed on the Theravada path? The answer must surely be, until the moment of crossing the stream, or, to use the canonical variant of the metaphor, the moment of entering the stream. This is the moment at which for the first time the profundity of the Dhamma is truly intuited and the fictitious nature of self is clearly perceived. After this, there is no turning back, no relapsing into state of woe, though the way ahead may still be long and possibly arduous. He who has reached this point is no longer a worldling, and ultimate enlightenment is assured. It is really only at this stage that one can with certainty judge the relevance of this or that higher doctrine. But the prospects which appear beyond this point will not be considered here. They are in the true sense esoteric. Stream entry is not an unattainable goal, though obviously it requires perseverance and humility. And its attainment, or otherwise, can be objectively measured. Self-deception in this respect is possible. Deception of the teacher is not. When the insight of the path has been truly gained, the possibility of infallibly discriminating right doctrine will for the first time be given. Likewise, the true meaning of non-discrimination will be grasped. The faculties of faith, energy, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom will at this stage be so developed that they can no longer be overthrown by their opposites. From faculties, they will have become powers. Ancient Oriental polemics have produced, in the name, incidentally, of non-discrimination, a spurious dichotomy between Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, in Mahayana, or greater vehicle, and Theravada teaching has been arbitrarily and illegitimately equated in modern times with the Hinayana. Let us drop these terms, which merely reflect long-defunct controversies. Theravada, Mahayana, Hinayana. From Sangha, March 1970. Theravada, the form of Buddhism based on the Pāli scriptures, which prevails in Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand, is sometimes referred to as basic Buddhism. This can be interpreted, according to taste, in various ways. We would claim that it represents the original teaching of Gautama the Buddha, free from later additions or modifications. Others would regard it as merely the groundwork on which higher metaphysical superstructures can be erected. There are several of these superstructures in different Mahayana schools. Let us look at this situation. The term Mahayana, meaning great vehicle, was coined in contrast to another term, Hinayana, meaning lesser vehicle. And Hinayana is the label commonly applied by Mahayanists to the Theravada. Strictly speaking, this is incorrect, as the Theravada school was probably scarcely known to the early Mahayanists who coined the term. What they had in mind were certain other ancient schools, more particularly the Sarvastivada, whose views differed comparatively little from the Theravada. But these schools have died out, and Oriental Theravadins now often accept the label Hinayana themselves. However, we shall not argue about labels. We can, if we like, refer, without implying any value judgment, to the narrow path and the expanded path. Our claim for the narrow path of Theravada would be that in the Pāli scriptures we find a way that works, that leads to the goal of Nibbana, or Nirvana in the Sanskrit form favored by Mahayanists, and that those scriptures contain all the essential features of the original doctrine proclaimed by the Buddha for the purpose of attaining that goal. There may be, here and there in the Pāli scriptures, some passages which derive from the later developments, but there is no evidence that non-Pāli sources contain anything vital that is missing from those scriptures. If this is so, then in the Pāli canon we have all we need for the attainment of nirvana. Let us, in this article, use the well-known Sanskrit form of this word. Such being the case, it would seem unnecessary to look any further afield. To say this is not, of course, to argue that Mahayanists cannot attain enlightenment. Because the Mahayana scriptures contain things not included in the Pāli canon, this does not mean they are wrong or useless. All teachings in the form of doctrinal formulations or prescribed practices are, and here all Buddhists of whatever school would agree in principle, fundamentally nothing but upayas or skilled devices. Any method that gets us moving on the right path is justified. The truth lies beyond words and theories, and whatever we can say about it is only relatively correct or provisional. A finger pointing at the moon. Some of the skill devices of the Mahayana schools may seem unnecessary to one type of mind, and yet be very helpful to another. Historically, In very general terms, Buddhism spread in the form of the narrow path to the south and southeast of India. It was taken in the form of the expanded path to the countries to the north and northeast. When, in modern times, it was introduced to the West, this was at first mainly in the narrow form, chiefly in the first place from Sri Lanka. Only considerably later were different forms of the expanded path imported, mainly from Tibet in the form of Tantrayana, often more or less diluted or reinterpreted by Theosophy, and rather later again from Japan in the form of Zen. These are the only three paths, out of various possible ones, which have any considerable following in the Western countries. It may be noted in passing that in Japan itself, the Pure Land school of Shin has far more followers than Zen, not to mention some of the neo-Buddhist schools, which often have only tenuous links with the original or even the expanded teaching. Incidentally, Japan also has the Shingon teaching, which has much in common with the Tantricism of Tibet, and yet has aroused little interest in the West. Could it be because Shingon lacks the sexual symbolism of Tibetan Tantra? Perish the thought. Doctrines apart, there is one thing that accounts in large measure for the preference some people have for the expanded path. It tends to be more colorful and apparently more immediately emotionally satisfying than Theravada. It makes the kind of appeal which in Christianity, Roman Catholicism makes in contrast to some of the more dour Protestant sects. Theravada is seen as dry and doctrinary, nor does it give a clear picture of the goal. It has been compared by one writer to a truncated cane, like a mountain whose lower slopes are visible, but whose peak is shrouded in mist. Zen might seem like the peak of the Fuji sun rising clear into the sky, its lower slopes invisible. Yet somehow, if one can only get into the right state of mind, one would find oneself instantaneously transported to the top. Actually, one is there already. To the Western followers of Tibetan Buddhism, perhaps, the even loftier peak of Everest might appear out of the mists, and transport would be forthcoming in wondrous wise if one managed to cope with certain mystic rituals. These descriptions are, of course, libelous. They merely indicate how the three paths may appear to the ignorant worldling who contemplated trying one of them. To such a worldling, the path of Theravada may seem too much like hard work, and the goal itself may appear far too uncertain. The other paths seem to offer both more exciting and at the same time perhaps easier possibilities. But after all, it is of nature of skilled devices that they are not what they seem. They are in fact educational toys, as a famous Mahayana parable puts it. A father induced his children to leave a burning house by showing them the most fascinating toys outside. Let us not indulge, then, in polemics, and let us remember that when Mahayana scriptures speak in superior tones, as they often do, about the adherents of the lesser vehicle, they are referring not to the existing Theravada, but to the long-extinct Sarvastivadins and others who may in fact have deserved at least some of their strictures, and who probably perished as a result in the deserts of scholasticism, the likely outcome of too much speculation and too little meditation. The Mahayana schools have a wide range of scriptures, scarcely any of which claim historical authenticity in the mundane sense. They presuppose some supplementary higher revelation. While this may at one level be regarded as pious fiction, we must realize that these writings are, after all, the work of advanced spiritual teachers and the result of profound meditation. If they are fiction, it is only in the sense of skilled devices, not vulgar fraud. Their claim is, and whether true or not, it is a serious claim, that they represent more profound aspects of truth than those revealed in the Hinayana scriptures, which they transcend but do not abrogate. A Christian writer called one such work the New Testament of Higher Buddhism, and though we may not accept the claim, this gives a rough idea of the intention. The main Mahayanist innovation is the exaltation of the Bodhisattva ideal above that of the Arahant. Coupled with this is the proclamation of wisdom and compassion as the twin pillars of the Mahayana. But before considering this further, let us briefly look at the Theravada scheme of things. Enlightenment is to be gained by treading the Noble Eightfold Path, which comprises 3 sections: wisdom, morality, and meditation, or mind training. A measure of mundane wisdom is necessary before one can even begin to tread the path. But the final fruition of supramundane wisdom can only come when the ethical and meditative sections of the path have been perfected. Thus the goal, in a sense, can be termed the wisdom gone beyond, or in Sanskrit, Prajnaparamita. This is, of course, the name given to the voluminous class of Mahayana sutras. Now, while it might be rash to equate the 2 wisdoms too hastily, it will be equally rash to distinguish sharply between them. We at least will not attempt to do so. An article in the Buddhist Path, some time ago, discussed the Bodhisattva, or rather Bodhisatta, ideal from the Theravada standpoint. In Theravada, the term Bodhisatta is applied, especially in the Jatakas, to Gautama before his enlightenment. He had to perfect various qualities before he was able to become a Buddha. It is also suggested that the original Sanskrit form of the word was not Bodhisattva, or enlightenment being, but Bodhisakta, or one intent on enlightenment. Either derivation of the Pāli is possible, but it goes to show that the current Sanskrit may be based on a misconception. In any case, the Mahayanist argument is that the ideal of gaining enlightenment for oneself is selfish, and that the Bodhisattva who seeks to save all beings represents a higher ideal than the Arahant. But since an Arahant is by definition selfless, this scarcely holds water. However, we have to consider the possibility that at the time when this view became prominent, there may have been many spurious Arahants whose enlightenment was merely self-delusion. Such people have been seen in the West too, in this day and age. And the authors of the Prajnaparamita scriptures never tired of reminding would-be bodhisattvas that though they were pledged to save all beings, there were in reality no beings to save. It is perhaps fair comment, based on some experience in the West, to say that spurious arahats, who generally keep themselves to themselves, are likely to be less of a nuisance than spurious bodhisattvas who go around preaching strange doctrines of their own, and who are anyway using their outward activities as an excuse for not looking within, where the real trouble lies. And the trouble, of course, with both is conceit. Far too many Western people, certainly more than one might have believed possible, have snapped up a few Buddhist phrases, generally at second hand. Then perhaps having had some experience which they have misunderstood, they have jumped to the conclusion that they are enlightened, or nearly so. Whether they then believe themselves to be arahants or bodhisattvas is of little importance. On the other hand, it is another matter whether there are any genuine arahants or bodhisattvas about in the West today.
Who knows? In any case, such people would never recognize them. Incidentally, Zen, which is technically Mahayana school, seems a bit mistrustful of bodhisattvas. It aims at self-help, and Huineng declared that we should take the bodhisattva vow to liberate all beings in our own minds. Let us return to basic Buddhism. The third section of the path consists of 3 steps: right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That some effort is needed is surely obvious, though some Zenful characters in the West have been heard to deny it. They should try just 1 week in a Zen monastery. Right mindfulness has been declared by the Buddha to be the one and only way to liberation. It is the way of Vipassana, insight wisdom. And how else could wisdom be gained but by mindfulness and clear awareness? Right concentration includes various things, among them the 4 Brahma Viharas, the development of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So by practicing these 2 steps of the path, we can develop the twin pillars of the Mahayana, wisdom and compassion. Perhaps it scarcely matters whether we set out to become an arahant or a bodhisattva. But suppose a bodhisattva, by practicing too much mindfulness, became an arahant by mistake. That would be terrible. Or would it? This has been Why Buddhism? Why Theravada? Theravada, Mahayana, Hinayana. 3 essays by M.O.C. Walshe. Narrated by Avia Rose Libni. Copyright 1971 by Buddhist Publication Society. Audio production copyright 2022 by Pariyatti. Pariyatti, a non-profit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.